Welcome to Healing from the Ground Up, a program of interesting conversations with interesting people. I'm Eric Greenleaf, and today we'll be talking for a second time with Bonnie Morse about the world of bees. Welcome again, Bonnie.
Thank you.
When we left our first conversation, you were in the middle of a swarm of bees and without special protective clothing and
Right.
with a glorious smile on your face. So I wondered if you would tell us a lot more about the life of bees in that swarm, the production of queens, and the way bees communicate in this vast, complex social arrangement.
So the swarm itself, as we talked about last time, is reproduction. It's a way the bees naturally reproduce. So when they've outgrown a nest cavity, when times are plenty, half of them will leave with the old queen and half of them stay and make a new queen. So for that portion of the colony that leaves, that's the swarm people see, and they'll find a location and cluster. The queen is somewhere in the middle of that cluster. And then about 5% of those bees, the oldest foragers, will actually be scouting for a new potential home site.
Ah.
And just like with the foraging, they'll dance to advertise a potential site and try to get other bees interested in it and scouts to go look at it. So the majority of the bees will just stay there while these scouts are doing this work.
And do they dance in midair or within the hive, or?
They'll dance on the outside of the swarm or on the bees themselves, and you can see this.
Huh.
And in fact, one of the leaders of the Bee Audacious conference, Tom Seeley, has spent his entire career studying swarms and bee communication and just this subject, and how they make a decision to when they decide on a nest cavity site.
Huh.
And what he found, they would actually take bees individually labeled, like 4,000 of them they would have to label, to an island that didn't have any natural nest cavities. Mm-hmm. And they would set up boxes and watch the bees and watch them dancing and watch them make this decision. So you would have bees that would come back and advertise for one site, and then there'd be a lot of activity for that. And then maybe it would shift to somewhere else. But ultimately, they reach a decision, they reach a consensus as a group.
Huh.
And when that decision has been made by the group that they're going to a nest site, they'll get the bees all warmed up and ready to fly, and then take off for that new home site. And the scouts who have been there before, again, hasn't been the whole swarm, just a percentage of them, help guide them to the new site and herd them. So if you ever had the pleasure of watching bees moving in midair, it's pretty remarkable. So that picture you saw of me was when one of our empty nest cavity sites that we'd set out for just this purpose was chosen, and we were there for the move-in.
Oh.
Hence the big smile. Yeah.
And tell us more, if you would, about the dance and how it communicates.
So they're communicating angle of the sun, and people like Tom Seeley, if you watch a swarm, he can tell you where they're going to be taking off to and about how far they're going to be going just by watching the angle and the number of rotations. They've got the waggle dance and the round dance, and just by watching this, it's going to tells the other bees, and to an informed observer will also tell them where they're going to be going.
So Tom can watch the dance of the scouts on the outside of the swarm.
Yeah.
And it gives him information about the angle of the sun and the direction they're going.
Even someone with very little information could probably discern, once it's been pointed out to them, about what the angle is that they're going to be taking off from.
So we can see the bees dance. How do the bees know what the dance is?
So the bees, and particularly it's been well studied inside the colony where they're advertising foraging locations. The bees are actually feeling the dance on the combs. So they're feeling, they're getting that information. So bees, we're communicating by talking primarily. Yeah. They communicate through vibrations and through chemical signals. So their world is a little bit different than ours.
And it sounds as though the communications are very sophisticated. They're vectorial, there are directions, intensities. Is there a kind of communication as we would have if we were getting a bunch of people together to go to a dance? We'd say, hey, you want to come along? We're going to have fun. There's a good band. Is there a kind of encouragement? A scout says, well, hey, you ought to come to our dance floor because it's really
Sure,
cool.
Yeah, sure. So the enthusiasm of the scout who's performing the dance will help bring in other people. So if you're really excited about it, you might, do a better job of pulling your friends in to go with you to that dance. And same thing with the bees.
So if it's a really wonderful source of the right kind of pollen, there might be a more enthusiastic dance or
Exactly.
a cavity where that scout thinks the group would thrive best.
Exactly. So, and there's also those bees that might disagree. And what Tom has seen also is, so you can have a bee that if they do a beeping and kind of headbutt the bees to try to get them to stop advertising if maybe they think they've got a better spot.
So one scout might...
Yeah, and makes a little beeping noise that Tom's been able to record. And particular with bees, they've found how they allocate their resources in the hive for foragers as opposed to the bees that are processing the food. Kind of like the factory is what Tom refers to it as, and how you allocate resources. If there's too much food coming in and it's taking too long there's not enough bees inside to process the food, you'll have bees that do this beeping and butting some of the bees that are trying to advertise and dance for a particular site.
To put them to work.
To get them back in work, you want to shift the work resources back into the hive for a little while.
And are the scouts aren't a separate caste? They're chosen from among the workers?
Exactly. So workers in the summer, they live about 6 weeks, and the first half of their life in that time, they never leave the hive. They're doing home chores. They're processing food, they're taking care of the larva, maybe they're taking care of the queen, maybe they're undertakers, maybe they're guarding the colony. And then about halfway through their life, they'll make the transition from being a house bee to a forager. During that transition, some might be better at scouts, some might be better at collecting propolis, maybe they're better at collecting pollen, and that's where it goes back to that diversity we talked about, how having a diverse workforce is beneficial for the hive.
Yeah, and in the same wise, having a diverse environment of pollens and plants.
Exactly.
And I suppose a wide enough territory too, so that the bees are not competing with each other swarms in too small a space or so. Yeah,
bees will fly here in Marin, probably the average is about 3 miles.
It's a long way.
It's a long ways. Those bees work really hard, those little bees. And they might travel.
Well, they fly there and back.
They're not going to go any further than they have to. We've got a Whole Foods in Santa Fe, so you're probably not going to drive to Novato if you can get the same thing here. And at the bees, it's the same thing. So if they can get what they need closer to home, it's a little more efficient to do that, and they'll do that. But if they need to, they're going to go further. So when things are dry around here, like July and August, they're probably flying a lot further for food.
And when a queen is developed, well, I guess the new queen is developed from the existing colony somehow.
Correct. So they they decide when they need to start making queen cells. The workers will choose which eggs, which young larvae they're going to be feeding royal jelly to, and make queens out of them. And it's usually not just one, it's usually multiple queens, sometimes 20 or 30.
Oh, in just one colony, there's the existing queen and then 20 or 30.
Well, if a swarm, the old one leaves, so now they're making new ones. And then it's survival of the fittest. So frequently what happens is that first queen to emerge will go around and try to eliminate her competition. And they can sting through the cells and kill the other queens.
Like Elizabeth I.
And then if they do make it out, then it's a fight to the death. And sometimes I'll go up to a colony and you'll find 3 or 4 dead virgins out front, and you know there's been a battle royale going on inside.
And then the surviving queen becomes queen of that existing.
Yes, but
group.
first she needs to get mated, and she's not mating in that colony. So this young queen, you know, maybe a week, if that, after she emerged, has to fly off, and she mates in midair with 10, 20, maybe 40 drones.
From all other colonies.
From other colonies, yeah. So she'll travel miles to mate, and so will some of the males, for that mating opportunity. And then she's got to make it back home. I mean, it's a perilous world out there. There's blue jays and wind. But if she makes it home, then she's mated, and unless they swarm, that's where she's staying.
And so the genetic diversity for this very localized species, they're not, they stay in the one container until they split. Diversity, again, in their environment, genetic diversity, speciation, if that happens naturally, are all very important features of the natural world. And I think you'd agree that the way humans have acculturated has more and more in modern times reduced diversity.
Correct.
Whereas in previous cultures it was often encouraged. Different castes and responsibilities and so on. We think of previous cultures as being more monocultures, but they're really very various. Even ceremonies and rules can change from village to village. So I think when we used to model our lives more on nature and force our lives less on nature, there was more genetic diversity, more cultural diversity, more food diversity. And in our first show, you spoke very convincingly and with sadness, I thought, about the development of monocultures, such as huge tracts of land devoted to corn or to almonds, and the necessity by the agriculturalists of importing bees just to pollinate those one crop cultures, and then to be taken away with stresses to the whole natural life of bee colonies.
Right.
So what ways have people developed to restore the bee populations and reinvigorate them and so on?
So this isn't really the first time that we've had major problems with pests or diseases for bees, although it, I think, is compared with some of the former crises, like about 120 years ago with American foul brood, for example, or what was seen in England, Isle of Wright's disease, which has kind of wiped out the black bee there, which they think was probably from tracheal mite. So these things have come up before, but right now, I mean, bees, it's just a death by 1,000 cuts. You know, it's not just the diseases, it's the nutrition and other problems coming. And so people are doing now, just like they did then, trying to select for bees that are showing natural resistance. Or as I mentioned about in the case of some of the African countries, just allowing the bees to develop them naturally, you know.
So that they wouldn't be so prey to mites or insecticides and so on.
Yeah, the insecticides, that might be a little harder one to to select for. But with the bees, it's estimated that if you just let, like with the varroa mites, if you just let bees go totally untreated in an area, you would probably lose 80, or if we did that in the United States, we would lose 80% of the stock. And then you would rebuild off of the 20% that survived. When you think about, though, how reliant we are for pollination on our crops, we just haven't let that happen. So in some areas and some people, what they're doing is just that. So we're selecting for bees that are showing natural resistance to the mites and the diseases that they vector, and then trying to increase that stock. And you know, it's being done, the beekeepers, some of the queen breeders are working with people like Marla Spivak, also from University of Minnesota, who developed a line of bees called the Minnesota Hygienics. They're selecting bees that recognize cells. In this case, they're doing a freeze kill, which they're killing the brood, and they're selecting bees that are more likely to recognize that there's a problem in that cell and clean it out.
Wow.
Yeah, and for some, they're specifically selecting then for the mites and colonies with fewer mites in them. The USDA lab in Baton Rouge brought in stock. They went to the area of the world where they think that the varroa mite first made the jump from the Asian honeybee to the European honeybee, which is a remote region in Russia. And they brought back semen from drones there. You're not allowed to import queens in the United States for some time.
So they just took the semen.
Yeah, but then, you know, have pretty successfully, you know, started a line of Russian stock here, and indeed they do show greater resistance to varroa mites. So it's still a pretty small program. Here in Marin, my husband and I, we were able to get some of the Russian stock a few years ago, and are really encouraged by what we see with them. And between that and selecting just swarms or whatever we find that has better resistance, just trying to rebuild from there and spread out those good genes and get those good drones out there.
And is this a way of developing a super bee, or is that a different enterprise?
I mean, I guess you could call it a super bee. It's really just select, you know, we know we have problems with the varroa mites, we know we have trouble with some of the diseases, so it's just selecting for bees that have some resistance already. Or have some way of dealing with those. Yeah,
the kind of the traditional way that plant and animal breeders have operated, right? To take the potato plant that's more resistant to blight, use their seeds.
So we've been selecting here in the U.S. You know, we didn't have a big founding population of honeybees anyways. They, you know, as the name suggests, they came from Europe with the settlers who had brought, you know, things like apples over and found that the native bees weren't pollinating them very well. And so they started bringing honeybees over. And it wasn't a big founding population, but they've definitely gone through a big genetic bottleneck. And one of the big ones was the popularity of the Italian honeybee, which is known for its gentleness and a big overwintering cluster, which is great for those guys that want to go to almonds early in the season, and also good honey production. But the big cluster favors varroa mite reproduction.
Oh.
If you're breeding bees all the time, you're also breeding mites. Whereas like the Russian honeybees tend to have a smaller brood nest, so they shut down some of their varroa reproduction.
So what's your guess about the best strategies for maintaining and reinvigorating the bee population?
You know, I think that it's gonna take a lot of different ideas. I think that in communities, people that are trying to do breeding and select from bees, places where we can take our losses. Most of the people here in Marin, they're not professional beekeepers.
Oh.
They're backyard beekeepers with maybe a couple hives, and if they're willing to support the attempts and take some of the losses while we try to rebuild stock, that's excellent. I also think that just connecting people, as we discussed earlier, people just making everyone, not just beekeepers, but people making better decisions about what plants they put in their yard and chemicals they use around their homes, and being more tolerant of other life forms. You know, you don't have to be afraid of it. Yes, like a swarm, maybe it's a lot of bees that have a stinger, but they're not really likely to use it. So rather than just acting aggressively against them preemptively when it's really not a threat, I think we'd go a long way towards being a little more, compassionate towards other life forms.
I like that very much. I think it's very important. If we're more compassionate with other life forms, we appreciate the variety existing between us and them, and we're less afraid and less aggressive. Since mammals tend to be more aggressive when afraid.
I think most animals, even insects, tend to be more aggressive when they're afraid. But I don't know, it's kind of a secret, isn't it? we're kind of the apex species right now. It's them that should be afraid of us, and they are, not the reverse.
Well, that's true. Yeah. We're the apex species, better and worse. So, what other things are you teaching to people when you help them set up a apiculture or a hive and so on? What do you find most important besides, as with all species, alerting people to the fact that we're the ones to be afraid of and we have to be gentle with the bees? Yeah. What other important lessons do you think you and your husband and others carry to people who are interested in sharing in the culture of bees? And
I'm not sure that it's myself or Gary that's doing the teaching. It's the bees that are doing the teaching, and we're just helping the people that we're with to kind of listen and observe and see what the bees are doing. There's so much for them to teach us, and I feel I learn something new every day. It's astounding, and there's just so much to learn. You know, they're having a really tough time surviving, which means there's a lot to learn, and there's just so many different things that they're struggling with. So I just see it as really us just helping people listen to them and observe more what they're telling us.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. A lot of sense, and again, anything interspecies or intercultural requires that you learn more and impose less.
Exactly, yeah. Just seeing where we can really help them and understanding that versus when we just need to step back and just let them do what they need to do.
Because it does sound, from your description, as though they have, for how many millions of years, developed a very complex and well-integrated bee culture.
There's so much for us to learn from them. Yeah.
What has surprised you recently, if anything, about your study of bees?
Oh, wow, that's a big question. Mm-hmm. Nothing really pops to mind immediately, but it really is just like a constant study of bees, and just thinking about, this breeding and selecting. It's really easy for us to put ideas and selecting for what we think they should be doing, as opposed to observing maybe ways that they're doing it themselves and trying to enhance that.
Tell me an example of that, if you would, because this is intriguing.
So a great example of that is something we'd noticed here in Marin, where we were seeing broodless periods when we wouldn't expect them, like during nectar flows.
A broodless period is?
When there's no young, so no larva or pupa in the colony. And in a mild climate like ours, and with some areas of the county that have food practically year-round, you would never expect them to be broodless. Versus, a place like Minnesota, when it's under 6 feet of snow, you would not expect the bees to have brood in their colony because they don't have a lot of resources to take care for that. And they can't go out and get more groceries. Yeah. So it was interesting to us to find these colonies that were queen-right, and there's food coming in, but they're broodless. And we actually did a 2-year study in Tiburon trying to understand them, taking stock, taking splits off of stock that had showed this behavior to see if we could understand it and understand if and how it was related to the mites, because it seemed that the colonies that went through these broodless cycles had higher survival rates, which makes perfect sense. So are the bees doing something that is not understood?
How does it make sense?
Because the varroa mites are breeding in the pupa, so they crawl into these cells and are reproducing in that 12 days when the workers are developing.
So if you have
developing no brood, you've got nowhere for the mites. Exactly. And then if you couple that with maybe good grooming behavior on the part of the bees to kill the mites or get them off themselves, then they could be cleaning themselves up from problems that they had, and also eliminating disease.
Hence, I guess the selection for good cleaners in the hive.
Exactly. Yeah. But I'm sure that there are colonies that are surviving, and we don't really understand all of the ways that they're doing it. So just observing that. And of course the colonies in Tiburon that we took data from every 2 weeks for 2 years didn't go through any of those interesting cycles. They did some other interesting things, but not that. But meanwhile, here around Marin, I'm coming upon these broodless colonies still all the time, you know. Small percentage, but still regularly, so it's intriguing.
So that sounds like that strikes you as a natural development among the bees to enhance resistance to the mites wiping them out.
Possibly, yeah. It would be a good way for them to control the numbers.
Again, they don't give the mites their preferred food source. Maybe the mites will go somewhere else or die off.
Or just become less virulent, you know, if they can develop some kind of relationship, maybe through something like broodless periods where they can coexist.
Kind of like the European bees did.
The Asian honeybees,
or the
yeah,
Asian ones,
exactly, yeah, exactly. So.
Your description of the bigger, quieter Italian bees was nice. I like that very much. There's so much in that world and the natural world that so many of us have been walled off from in a way. You know, people go camping, they go into nature, but the feeling that you give when you speak about being taught by nature and learning from it and providing a safe environment for natural life has been lacking in our general culture for a long time. And it's a privilege to hear you speak this way about learning from the bees, being surprised by the bees, and particularly observing their natural experiments in survival and even speciation, if it come to that. So, is there any last thing you'd like to say or like us to think about the next time we see bees?
Well, not just about seeing bees, but I would just like to say the bees have given me tremendous hope with how people connect with them, and then through them, the environment. So this crisis of the last decade has brought so much attention to pollinators, and it's also brought people's attention to you know, just how they're part of the problem and can be part of the solution.
That's
and
exactly well said. And Bonnie, thank you so much for speaking with me and with all of us. This has been Healing from the Ground Up, our guest Bonnie Morse. And this is Eric Greenleaf. We hope you'll join us again in our future shows. Goodbye for now. So, yeah, that's really spectacular kinds of things that you're talking about. I guess a lot of work to restrain the natural impulse to meddle.
yeah, it's kind of hard.
Which I certainly have. And
We all have it, don't we?
know,
I mean,
that's
humans
well,
are taught
let's
that.
see what we can do to...
Yeah. Yeah.
Even kids, right? They'll play with bugs rather than just watch them.
Well, and what are we doing?